I don't think it's heavy-handed. I think the movie does a great job of exploring these ideas, and particularly in exploring them in regards to sort of a fresh audience, an audience that probably doesn't think about or read about these kind of philosophies or theories in their day-to-day lives. Cameron is appealing to the average young American audience, and he's doing it very effectively. He then talks about,
All I really came to see was that blue chick's tits. And I got this?
They've sent us a message.
well, if that's all he came for, then why didn't he just sit at home and jack off to porn on his computer? You've come to see a movie. If you had misconceptions about what the movie was, that's your fault, not the movie's fault. He then goes on to show this little bit where he listens to an answering machine where there's some guy telling him how he should feel all guilty about, destroying the Native Americans and everything. But again, this is very surface, very bland interpretation of the film. I don't think Cameron is saying we should all feel guilty about how the forebears of this nation destroyed the Native Americans and massacred an entire continent of people. What we should be is aware of it. We should be aware of what history is and what our civilization is based around, and its ideologies and in its methods. And honestly, his inhibition to want to be subjected to these ideas of the exploitation of native peoples by Western industrialized society is somewhat troubling. I mean, maybe you don't want to go to a movie and have to deal with these thoughts, but fine, go to a different movie then. This is what this movie's about. If you don't like it, fine, but that's your opinion. That has nothing to do with whether or not the movie's good or not. He then mentions interspecies romance and sex, which, if you think about it, actually it's not, because Jake is in a hybrid Na'vi body, so he actually is the same species as the Na'vi. So it's not interspecies. I'll talk more a little bit about this interspecies type stuff in a bit. The interesting thing is that he compares this idea that, maybe you forget in Titanic that this disaster is looming because you get wrapped up in the story. But then in Avatar, the threat of military action is always looming. But that's not really true. There's huge sections of the film where Jake is adapting to the Na'vi way of life, falling in love with the girl, and all this other stuff that is very easy to forget about the fact that he's a soldier, and ultimately this is probably going to end up in war. I mean, yeah, that is always looming, but no more than a bunch of people on the Titanic. They're on the Titanic! How is that less in the background constantly than the threat of military action in Avatar? That's inane. He then takes a really strange turn and starts criticizing Cameron and Avatar for being effective. He points out that he doesn't think the movie's great or whatever. He says it's effective, and he says at pulling on the audience's heartstrings. I think one of the best aspects of this film is that it is effective. Why else would Cameron make this movie with all this messaging in it, with all these themes and ideas, if he wasn't going to try to be effective at it? I mean, this is also the problem I have with people saying this is some white messiah film. It's not a white messiah film. Cameron wanted to make a character, a main character, who his main target audience would associate with. So he's a white, young male. That's why he's in there. This isn't anything about tugging on heartstrings as some sort of cheap trick. This is an age-old technique of getting your audience to associate with your protagonist. Now, the biggest irony of this review to me is go back now and watch his reviews of the episode of the first episodes of Star Wars. Watch episode 1, the first review. The whole first section of the review is him talking about how when you make science fiction movies, the general best format to take is to set it up where you have a protagonist that the audience can associate with. Watch the whole thing. He does a brilliant job of covering all this and explaining it, and how miserably episode 1 did at achieving this idea of getting in a character there that's a protagonist that you can associate with and who will guide you through the story. And yet now he seems to be criticizing Avatar for expertly doing that exact thing. It makes no sense.
I picked a few examples to illustrate this point. Marty McFly, John McClane, Billy Peltzer, Sarah Connor, Neo, Charlie Bucket, Peter Parker, Cliff Secord, Johnny Rico, Rocky Balboa, and Kevin Bacon.
Now, he then does go on to make a good point where he talks about how people who have been reported wanting to commit suicide after this film because they're so depressed that their lives aren't like what's in the movie or whatever. And I will admit he has a point, but I don't know if that's necessarily a critique of the film, because Cameron made and created a world that's so beautiful and so attractive to people that our world and the flaws of our world seem so depressing in comparison. Now, does that mean I think people should get suicidal from watching a frickin' movie? No, absolutely not. But it speaks to how brilliant a job Cameron did at making this film. Now, I also want to speak here a minute about this idea of pulling on the audience's heartstrings and appealing to emotion. I've heard these same type of arguments from people who are criticizing in political debates, people that make an appeal to emotion. If that is all you are doing, then yes, that is not a very valid debate point or a honest way of doing things. For instance, appealing to Tea Partiers on emotion, based on emotion that the healthcare plan will create death panels. And your grandmother is going to have to go before a death panel to decide whether she's going to die or not. That is an example of appealing to emotion without any other basis, without any other justification or points, because it's all based in fallacy. There were no death panels. However, appealing to emotion is perfectly fine if you have a decent justification for it. For example, when environmentalists advocate for protecting an endangered species because it's cute or beautiful, if that were the only reason, then yeah, it might not be a very substantial argument. However, there's many other reasons why it is a good reason, because of protecting the diversity of a biosphere or whatever. And on top of all that, I fail to see how it's a bad thing to advocate for protecting something because that thing is beautiful. The preservation of a beautiful thing, is that not enough justification in and of itself? So yeah, it always depends on what the basis of the appeal to emotion is. Just criticizing something for being an appeal to emotion is not, in my opinion, a valid criticism. It's an absolute standpoint, and it doesn't really hold up under scrutiny, I don't think.
Okay, I'm gonna stop using stupid metaphors, and I'm gonna break this shit down for you. Here we go. You got two things you need to do to win over the audience with a movie like this. Make the audience hate the villains, in whatever way you can, no matter how cheap. The military in this film is run by a comical stereotype of the crew-cut wearing racist white man.
That's sort of true, but I mean, the exaggeration of your villain's evilness is a long-standing tradition in not just films, but in literature in general. I mean, hell, Shakespeare turned Richard III into a literal monster. He's this hunchbacked monster so that he could get his audience to truly despise that character. I mean, the real Richard III wasn't like that at all. But Shakespeare used all these techniques because he wanted to get his audience to hate this guy, because he was this disfigured, ugly wretch of a human being. So I'm not so sure I really buy this argument. And on top of it all, there's something about his character that I at least find, not endearing, that's not the right word, but, he's a hard ass, I mean, yeah, he's an asshole, he's a jerk, he's very single-minded, he's not very intelligent, but he is kind of cool. And admittedly, I think that just has more to do with Stephen Lang's performance, his portrayal of the character. I just think he does a good job in the role. It's just a fun role. I mean, yeah, like I said, it's one-dimensional, but there are one-dimensional characters. They're called static characters. They're not there to change or have much depth. They're there as a plot device.